home, and I'm with my grandfather. And why don't you tell me your name and your birthday, etc.?
I'm your granddad, and I'm Arthur P. Korach. I was born in October 11th, 1907. We lived on East 73rd Street at that time. And my father and mother, your grandparents, great-grandparents, moved there at the turn of the century, in 1900, when they were married. You may be interested to know that Pop, as we called him, and Mom.
Well, let's. Where were they? Why don't you tell me where they were born?
They were born in. Pop was born in Hungary, and Mom was born either, I think, in this country because she was a tiny child. Maybe she was hadn't been born yet when her mother came over, and they lived in New York.
And what was her full name?
Her name was Sidonia Lefkovics, Lefkovics.
And what was? Do you know where your mother's mother was born?
My mother's mother was born in Hungary.
And your mother's father?
In Hungary.
And what about your grandfathers?
My grandfather, my great-grandfather were born in Hungary. And I visited their little community, their village, where they lived in 1929. Of course, they were gone by then. Your great-grandfather, my great-grandfather. My grandfather came to Cleveland, Ohio, and lived on Hampshire Road.
And his name was?
His name was Jacob Korach. And my grandmother passed away in childbirth. And it was the custom in those days that the widowed husband would usually marry the next oldest sister. And that's what happened. My grandfather married his sister-in-law, the next sister-in-law.
Do you remember their names?
I have their names on a sheet of paper at home. I'm sorry I didn't bring it with me because I could give you the exact.
Well, we can get that another time.
Yeah.
Do you remember hearing any stories about your ancestors, either on your father's or mother's side of the family, and why they came to America? And
well, yes, it wasn't uncommon for them to leave and come to the United States. My father came to this country at the age of 16, and he went to Chicago first. He had some friends in Chicago, and he lived there for a couple of years, and in 1896 he came to Cleveland. It was a question of whether he was going to come to Cleveland or Minnesota, and it was a McKinley-Bryan election, and McKinley was elected, so that was Cleveland.
So he was between McKinley and McBride. Whoever won the election, he was
whoever won the election. That's where we.
One was assigned to Cleveland.
One was assigned to Cleveland. One was assigned to Minnesota.
So, in other words.
So he came here shortly after that time, and he opened a China store on the west side. And he was very unhappy with the China store. And I'll never forget a man by the name of Toby Felber, who is with the SM Hexter Company. His sons are with the SM Hexter Company now. Worked for my dad. He said one day he made up his mind to get out of that, and he busted up the China and pushed it out, and that was it. They closed the store, and he went in the manufacturing business.
Do you remember why your mother's family came to the United States, to America?
Yes, my mother's family came to the United States because the oldest son, and I think there were about 2 sons and 4 daughters at that point. Some of the boys had died in the World War I at the invasion of Hungary, and I think there were 3 or 4 of them that were killed. But the living ones, the oldest one was a doctor, and he came to New York, and he was one of the very important men, doctors in his field. And he was an optician and had brought more babies into the world, I think, or as many as any doctor in New York at that time. And of course it was, they lived on East 81st Street in a brownstone house. It was a beautiful home. And he had a very attractive wife, and they had 4 children and their family. The balance of the family, of my mother's family, the girls married in this country. They all lived in this country. Their parents came over to this country, and they lived in New York. Can you hold it for a minute?
No, it's okay. Keep going.
Now, what's the next question?
And what did they do when they came to New York? Do you remember where they lived or how long they were there for?
Well, they got into business, and they did very nicely. They all seemed to be very well off, and the children married well. That phase of the family was a little less familiar because they were in New York and we were in Cleveland. But we used to see them all frequently. We'd go to New York. And there were a lot of interesting stories. I'll never forget. My parents first took me to New York. We were staying at the Vanderbilt Hotel, and my uncle, another brother of my mother's, a younger brother, asked me what I wanted for a present. And I said I wanted a gold watch. I couldn't have been over 9 years old or something like that. And he went out to buy the gold watch, and after he left the room, the hotel room, I said to my mother, I wish I had said a rabbit. That was always a laughable story. But the families we were always close as a family. My mother's sisters and her brothers, my uncle, the doctor. We had a beautiful home in New York, in Arkville, New York, a summer home, and a lot of acreage. It was next to the Gould estate. The Gould was a railroad magnate in those days, and I used to go there and spend a month in the summer with him and his family. The sons were very important. Armand Earth became a partner at Carl M. Loeb Rhodes and passed away in around 1970. He was a very astute financial man and had a renowned reputation. Getting back to the Korach family, my father started the S. Korach Company, which was manufactured ladies' skirts, and in those days skirts were very important to women.
Around what time was this?
That was in 1896 when they started, actually, but they built the factory on Superior Avenue in 1912. Walker and Weeks, the noted architects in Cleveland, were the architects for it. And it was a 60,000 square foot building on 2 floors in the basement. And they did very well. My father was known as a skirt king in those days. And they sold to fine stores like Marshall Field, Kaufman's of Pittsburgh, and other reputable department stores, specialty stores. And the business went until 1934, And my father always told me that if anything happened to him, to liquidate the business, which I did. And from there I went into the men's clothing business, first starting at the Joseph and Feist Company in Cleveland.
Let's before we get into that, do you remember anything more about your grandparents?
Yes, my grandparents had 5 boys and 6 girls.
No, this is on the Korach side.
On the Korach side. And of course they were all half sisters and brothers because of not the same mother. But they were very friendly and very close. And many of them were, the boys were in business with the S. Korach Company. My dad took them in as young men. And he also took in some of the husbands of his sisters. And it was a very successful company in those days. It was one of the largest of the women's manufacturing businesses in Cleveland. They had 3 factories, Cleveland, Ashtabula, Ohio, and Canton. And then they also opened a plant in Akron, Ohio. But the unions came in and that was the end of the business. They just made it impossible for the manufacturing to be competitive in Cleveland.
Tell me something about your father's father, your grandfather on your father's side.
My grandfather lived to be 82 years old, and he was a little man, about my size. Unfortunately, he used to come to the factory, and people in the factory loved him. He would go around, say good morning to them all, and always knew about their families and everything.
And his name was?
Jacob.
Jacob, okay.
And he had a brother in Akron, Ohio, by the name of Emil, who was a very fine gentleman also. And the family was, the Korach family was, they all of them did well. They have, it's a big family of children, and recently they had a reunion of which there were over almost 100 people there, including cousins and their closest relatives. Some of them, some of the younger generation turned out very well. They all were successful. One was an architect, another was in various businesses.
Can you, going back to your grandfather though, do you remember, like you mentioned he used to visit, what did he do? Did he work at all when he was in America?
Yeah, he worked in the factory. My father took him in the business, but he was up in years in those days, and he used to come in every morning, and I remember when I first went to the S. Korach Company, he would go home either before lunch or just after lunch, and one of my jobs was to take him home, which I did. I didn't start in the company until 1931. After I went to Ann Arbor college, my senior year, I said to my dad, I'd love to get into business in a foreign country. And we decided on I would go to Paris, because that was a couturier head of the world. That's where all the important designers came from at that time. And so I went to work for a commissionaire. Among his clients was Bergdorf Goodman and other fine stores in the United States. And I was there for 9 months, learned the business. We used to take the clients around, go to the openings of the fashion world, and my mother, father, and my sister, Helene, my younger sister, who was not married in those days. She was just graduated from Connecticut College. came over in the summer in June, and I joined them, and we traveled for 2.5 months in Europe. So it was a wonderful experience. I have pictures of them, movie pictures,
Which we have seen.
which you'll enjoy having, I'm sure. And I've had them taped, all taped, so that you can take a look at them.
Your grandmother on your father's side, what?
She was one of several children too, and she was a very nice woman. She had had 10 children of her own, which is not an easy thing to do, and raised them well. And they lived a very quiet life. It wasn't like my parents, my father and mother, who had many friends in Cleveland, and were very social. They were members of the Excelsior Club and then the Oakwood Club. When they joined the Oakwood Club in 1914, I think it was, or 1912, something like that. I can remember as a youngster going out there. In those days, it was fairly far out. And in our home on 73rd Street, where we lived until we moved to Fairmount Boulevard, we had many close neighbors that we were lifelong friends. The Dowbys, the Hexters, the Garsons. There were 6 or 8 families, all lived within a few houses of each other, and it was always remained friendly.
What was the address on Fairmount, do you remember?
1950, on Fairmount, 2621 Fairmount Boulevard. My dad bought the property. I think in those days he paid $8,000 and held it for a year or two, and then they decided to build on it and build a gorgeous home, which was a brick 2-door house. It had many innovations for those days. It had a ballroom on the 3rd floor with a billiard room, with a billiard table and guest quarters and a playroom. And we had a dumb elevator that took the food up and everything else, and we had a lot of parties in the ballroom. It was a great life, as you can imagine. And there was Helene was married in the house. I think that was the first wedding there. And Mildred's daughter, Shotzi, your cousin, was married in the house in 1947. We had many happy occasions in that house, and it was a house that was open to everybody. I once tried to figure out how many people were in and out of that front door, and I came up to 10,000, then I stopped.
It must have kept you busy for a couple days.
Well, I'll tell you, Mom ran a different kind of a household. You wouldn't understand it today. We had wonderful help, and everything was so, it was no difficulty for her to do anything. She had a staff of help that was excellent. She had a cook and a maid and a laundress and a chauffeur, and we'd sit down to dinner, and if many times when we had friends over, she'd say, well, now what would you have? Would you like to have roast beef? Would you like chicken? Would you like this, that? It made no difference. The food was there, and it was served, and it was just delightful. Nobody ever forgot about the food at the Korach family.
I remember going and having some big meals when she lived on Shaker Boulevard.
When Mom moved into the apartment on Shaker Boulevard in 1952 or 53, it was the end of 1952, and I went to visit her the first time, and I go into to the kitchen. It was a small refrigerator in those days compared to what we had on Fairmount Boulevard. And she had about 6 pounds of butter in the house. And I said to her, what do you need all these 6 pounds of butter for? Well, this was a carryover from Fairmount Boulevard. It always was well stocked. and had everything in it.
Speaking of your mother, why don't you tell me a little bit more about her parents? Now, what was her father like?
Well, her father, I was still a very young man when, child rather, I should say, when they were older, because my mother was the youngest and my father in his family was the oldest. So that it was very difficult for me to know too much about them. They were just lovely people and had
What were their names again?
Lefkovics, Lefkovics.
And their first names?
I can't remember their first names.
Do you remember what he did?
Well, he was in Europe. He was like most of them. They were either did farming, and if they lived in a little community, they would have maybe a small store, but it was nothing that important. He was just a highly regarded gentleman in the community where he lived, and they were fine people. I mean, I can't pin it down. The interesting experience I had, though, when we were in Europe, when we went to the town, we went to the city where my father was born and where my mother's family lived, not too far away, and the landowner's son, who was a real fine gentleman, had us for tea, and my father and this young man used to play together as children, and of course it was quite a memorable time. We spent the afternoon with him, walking around the place, and it was beautiful. My grandfather had a cottage on the property, and they were landowners, and they had tenant farmers, and that was how they made their money in those days. The trip to Europe was probably one of the most unusual trips because it was before World War II, it was after World War I. That country was prosperous, Europe was prosperous, and travel in those days was by ship. And my dad took a car over, a Lincoln car, and we had many interesting experiences. There was just so much that I could go on for hours about it. I've never forgotten. But when I was in Paris, how thrilling it was, and also when we traveled. Interestingly, Newton D. Baker, who was Secretary of War in the Wilson administration, that's the First World War, was a dear friend of my father's. He was a top lawyer in the city of Cleveland, was squired with Baker Hostetler firm, and we traveled with them in England, and we met other people. The Hayes family traveled with us too. We were in Vienna together with them, and in Paris, and Europe in 1929 was probably at its peak from the standpoint of travel and fun. It was, I could just go on and rave about how wonderful that summer was. What good times we had.
This is a question that I don't know if it would be appropriate or not, but do you know of any black sheep or notorious characters on either side of the family?
Well, there was really, fortunately, there were no black sheep that I know of. They may have been, because we may have considered them sort of odd at the time, but really nothing is historically damaging or different about them than anybody else. Tony, I want to ask you a question. I think we'd be better off to concentrate on the Korach family and the Hayes family, which I knew much better,
Okay,
And-
let's
and-
do that right now.
Because we can go on for
Right,
hours.
well, that's a perfect time to bring it up, because the
All
next
right.
question was, how did your parents meet and fall in love? Do you know?
Yes, my dad, I don't know whether he met my mother, he must have met her when they were living, when he was in Cleveland, she was in New York, and she worked for a judge, she was a secretary to a judge in New York, after she finished her schooling. And when my father met, I don't know how he met, he knew the family from Europe, of course, and my uncles, my mother's brothers, and when he went to New York on business, he would call her, and they decided after going together for 2 years, I believe, that they were going to get married. My father wouldn't marry my mother until he could support her in the manner in which he thought he should, and I think that I remember he telling me that, because when I got married, of course, I was making $75 a week, and he was making $12,000 a year before he married my mother. And in those days, $12,000 would probably be the equivalent of $200,000 today. They always lived beautifully. I went to university school. Helene went to Halfway Brown. We all had a good education. Mildred, of course, went to camp. She didn't want to go to private school.
So where did she go to school?
She went to East High School in Cleveland. And the crowd in Cleveland, the group that we went with, we were children together, most of us. And we just remained good friends right through our lifetime. The Greases, primarily, Mildred's dearest friend was Lucille Grease, and my friends were Alfred Farber and John Tudor. Unfortunately, John was Alfred passed away years ago in 1953 as a young man, and we all kept friendly.
Did your parents ever talk about the circumstances around which they got married? Or do you remember where they were married, or?
No, I'm sure I think they were married in New York, my father and mother, but there was no special significance to it. My mother came to Cleveland as a bride, and they lived in a small apartment until 1902, when they bought the house on 73rd Street. And my sister Mildred was born in 1904.
Where did your mother grew up in New York then?
Yes.
Did she ever tell you much about her childhood?
Well, the childhood, no, not too much. They fortunately were they were comfortable. I don't think they were different from any of the other families of their size in New York. It was, the boys were the oldest son was a doctor, and the next brother, Morris, was in the ladies' coat and dress business, very high class, upper scale price business, and they were comfortable.
And was your mother working, or what was she doing before she
as a young lady, she was a secretary for the judge.
Oh, okay, that's right.
She still remembered her shorthand until she died. She could still remember how to take shorthand. She used to type her own letters when she wrote to us. And interestingly, my mother got active in Belfair, which was the orphans' home in those days, and lived to be one of the, when she passed away, was one of the, had more years of service as a director with the orphans, with Belfair than any other of the directors. He was on the board for many, many years. They had the quarterly meetings, and they got their funds from 5 states of the, in connection with the B'nai B'rith. And people like Fred Lazarus of a Federated Department Store, who never missed a quarterly meeting. He was president for 18 years. And with all his activity in business, he always showed up at the meetings. And this, they had the same type of representation in Cincinnati, and Detroit, Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Louis. They all used to come for the meetings, and they were wonderful people. And they all did a splendid job.
Do you remember any stories about, did she tell you any stories about your father's courtship with her, their dating, or?
No, they used to, well, I don't know too much about their courtship, but when they were married, they had many close friends, and they used to go on vacations. They went with Alfred Stodder's parents, Dr. Henry Stodder and Hannah, who eventually turned out to be close neighbors on Fairmount Boulevard. And primarily their friends were mostly my mother's bridge, which were all close friends of hers, and my father's. My dad was active in, he did in the community fund, and he also was very active in the temple, and was considered among the more generous givers during his lifetime.
What did your mother look like? If you could describe her, how do you remember her now?
Well, you remember Mom.
Sure I did. But I remember her when she was in her 80s.
Well, she was a very good-looking woman. Not what I'd call a beauty, but she was a very handsome woman, and well-groomed, and very meticulous in her housekeeping and in her dress.
What color hair did she have?
She had brownish hair, and she was a very outstanding lady. Naturally, I would know more about that probably than anybody else, because I was brought up with her. She brought me up, and not only that, but our family, as you know, has been a very close family. We've all stuck together. My 2 sisters and I, and we've get a lot of pleasure out of each other. It's a wonderful thing, and I hope that you and your brother and sister will have the same kind of a life.
I think we do already.
You do already. When I've been with you, I just see that you all get a lot of pleasure out of each other, which I'm very fortunate to see.
And we're fortunate to have it. Tell me something about your mother that would characterize her, if you could remember one story or one incident or...
Well, I'll tell you a story that's typical of my mother that would tell you about her, give you an insight into the lady. A friend of mine from Detroit came to Cleveland on business, and he called my mother at about 11 o'clock on a Sunday morning. And everybody called her Mom. He called up and he said, "Mom, it's Miles Finsterwald." My mother answered, "Miles, where are you?" He said, "I'm downtown, I just came in." He said, "Well, come on for lunch. Come out for lunch." He says, "I can't, I've got 18 men with me here at business." And so she says, "Bring them all." And that was Mom. Nothing was ever too much for her.
What kind of education did she have?
Mom got her degree, a high school degree, did not go to college. But she continued. She specialized really in children care, child care for the orphans' home and so forth. She was involved in the decorating committees and also in the psychiatric study for children.
During the week, when your father went to work, I know she ran the home, but what else would she do? She was involved in these charities and.
Oh yes, she was very active in the temple. She was on the board of the temple as a director, served as a director for many years. And she was always, and she had her bridge game, and she played golf, and she kept busy all the time. They did a lot of travel too. They would go to Europe every fall, or they would then take trips out west. And they led a very pleasant life.
How would they travel when they went out west?
They would take the super trains, the super chief, and the I don't know I can't remember all the different trains, but it would take 3 nights usually on the train.
To get to
California.
And
They go to Los Angeles or San Francisco. See, well, my father, he took my mother on a few trips, there were combination business trips and pleasure trips. And they would go to out west via Omaha and various other cities. On one trip he took ill, had to go to I think he had pneumonia. 1918, it was during the war. And we had, there were so many things going on in those years, and what I would call my younger days, when I was in school and in high school. The First World War was a period of not as austere as the Second World War because there were no planes or anything, but it was they rationed food to a degree. It wasn't as severe as in World War II, where rationing became very important, particularly meats and butter and dairy products and so forth. But I believe that during my lifetime, living through 2 major world wars, our country life during the war was not too difficult for us. It was very difficult for the rest of the world, but we were fortunate. And I don't think that we ever suffered really any severe hardships, fortunately.
Your mother around the house, I know she, like you said, she ran the household. Did she like to cook ever?
Oh, she didn't. She knew how to cook, but she never really spent a lot of time in the kitchen. She always was able to, fortunately, to get good cooks. We only had two cooks in our my whole lifetime that I remember at home. And but she was always a wonderful parent to the girls and to me, and she knew all about our activities, and she participated in our activities as best she could. And she was a very well-organized person.
What was her favorite dish when it comes to food?
I'm trying to remember. There were so many of them. I think probably fowl was the best that she liked. But I think the girls could answer that better than I am. Sorry, but they're not one of them here to tell us. But she just loved good food, no matter what it was. And she served, she was known all over the country for her food. We had so many different variety of guests that even the young people that came to visit me and visit Mildred, and Helene would never forget the food and how wonderful it was, how wonderful comfortable our house was. and how much fun they had.
Did she have any hobbies or was she artistic at all?
Yes, my mother went as a young lady, when she first came to Cleveland, she took up painting. And then she did some pretty nice work. And we used to kid her about it. I mean, as we got older. And she was just a wonderful mother and a wonderful wife to my father. She was. I never once heard my father criticize anything at home. It was unbelievable. He was just happy with everything at home, as were all of us.
Was she musical at all?
No, she was one of the charter members of the Women's City Club, and she got active in that. She got active. She would go to. She loved music, and she would participate and go to the symphonies and whatnot. She was just an all-around well-educated person. She knew she wasn't completely devoted to any one hobby. She did many things, but they had a wonderful life together.
No, you mentioned she did some paintings. Are there any still around?
I don't think there's any paintings left. When we sold the house on Fairmount Boulevard, it was very funny, very interesting. The man who bought the house bought everything that we wanted to sell. He bought the complete dining room, the rugs, the drapes, anything in the house. And it was sort of a joke because he saw the paintings and he said to Mildred, "Do you think Mom would want to get rid of these paintings?" And Mildred said, "I doubt whether she would. Very treasured paintings." And of course they weren't the greatest, but they were good. And we always laughed about it, that he wanted to buy them, and we sold him some of the paintings. But I told this man, I said to him, his name was Bill Southworth, and I said, "Bill, before you buy anything, go downtown and shop. Go to Romer Brooks, go to Alley Brothers, go wherever, Sterling and Welsh were the stores in Cleveland." And I said, "Make sure that this is what you want." And everything was made for the house at Romer Brooks. It was beautiful furniture, much of which you know because Mom, your mother, has still got a lot of that furniture. And the man said, Bill said to me, he said, "Arthur," he said, your mother's taste is impeccable, and we'll buy anything she wants to sell that she can't use."
And this was in 1952, is that when you said
1952.
that? I wonder where.
53.
Mm-hmm. Bedtime stories. Did you remember if she told you any bedtime stories when you were little?
I don't remember too many of them. We had a Nursey. Nursey came to us when Helene was born, which was in 1910, and she was with us for 40 years. And she became sort of the major domo of the house. Parents would be out of town, she'd run the house, and she took wonderful care of all of us. And she lived in a small city called Navarro, Ohio, near Canton. And she had a nice little house there, and then finally she was with us, as I say, for 40 years. And after Helene had a child when Nursey was still with us. Mildred also had children when she was with us, so that the chores in the house went on pretty much the same all those years. Certainly all the years that she was with us. I think this may be a little too commercial,
What?
these questions. I think we should talk more about it.
Well, we're gonna get was your mom strict at all, or?
I never can remember a serious punishment. We were living on 73rd Street, and I'm not sure whether the wallpaper was just put up or not, but I got a hold of a crayon, and I marked up one whole wall with crayon. And I don't remember whether I probably got a spanking, but I don't remember it. It couldn't have been that difficult a spanking. And the girls, I never recall any time any of us had any problem with our parents. I'm sure that we were reprimanded and lectured to when we were wrong, but I don't recall many instances of it. We all did pretty much the way we wanted to. We looked after each other, and that was the upbringing we had from our parents.
Now, what about her sense of humor? Do you remember anything that was really
Oh
funny?
yeah, my mom had a great sense of humor, and there were many funny instances. Our friends, of course, would kid her, and she got along well with them. And it didn't happen in Cleveland, but it was funny because on the ship that they came over to, that they crossed on in coming to Europe in 1929, the sea was pretty rough, and my mother was walking through the salon, and she sat down on the piano stool because it got a little rough. So the steward said to her, "Mrs. Korach, are you going to give us a concert?" It said that in passing, which was, of course, a great sense of humor, because he didn't want to say, "Are you not feeling well?" because it was rough, the sea was rough. But this was the sort of thing that went on. We never had, we had so many laughs and so many good times. And the bridge, of course, the women on the bridge, there were, I think, 12 or 13 of them. They remained close friends until they all passed away. And they were all characters, individual characters, but had a lot of good laughs and fun. It was great living in those days. I don't know how to relate it to anything that we have today. We all have good friends. We all have a good time, but nothing was quite as wonderful as in those days.
Your mother's attitude towards sex and sexuality, do you remember if she ever gave you sex education or taught you?
Never said a word. As far as, I don't know what she did with the girls, Mildred, with Bette and Mildred, but she never said anything to me. And my dad the same way. I'll never forget when I went to Europe, he said, "Just remember, I never had any problems. I don't expect you to have any."
And what did you think that meant?
Well, he was talking about sexual problems.
How were young men and women expected to behave when you were growing up in regards to sex?
Well, I can only tell you what my impression was. We had a great deal of respect for the girls that we went with. And I don't know, there may have been relationships in those days, but it was not the normal. It was the unusual. And there were one or two of our friends that were sort of risque, and had problems. But I always treated the young ladies that I was with, who were daughters of of our parents, with the greatest respect, and the same as I would expect them to treat my sisters. We never did anything that anybody would be ashamed of. And if we wanted, if we were looking for that, we would either meet somebody who was not in the same
circle.
Same circle, or in the same status.
Religious beliefs.
But we were Reformed Jews, and we lived as Reformed Jews. We observed the holidays, but we also observed Christmas and non-Jewish holidays. It was Americanized religion as opposed to Orthodox or European background.
What about your mother's health? Did she enjoy any sports? You mentioned golf.
Well, my mother and father played golf. They used to ride horseback. They used to go horseback riding. I used to go with my dad. Every Sunday we would ride. And he loved horseback. He was a good rider. And I continued it. And even kept a horse in New York, in Central Park, when I first moved there. And would ride in the park. And when I went to Ann Arbor, Michigan, to get my credits for athletics, I had a group of girls. I instructed them and took them horseback riding. That was my credit. I was the instructor for 8 or 10 girls that we'd go out.
Just you and 8 or 10 girls?
Yeah.
That must be terrible.
I was the instructor. But it was a lot of fun. And college in those days was such a luxury. At the fraternity house, we had good health, and the food was excellent. It was during Prohibition. And one funny story is I had the bootlegger I was in charge of getting the bootleg whiskey for the fraternity house. And I invited the bootlegger, who had a bar in Ecorse, Michigan, which is right across from Canada. They used to bring in the booze. And I said, come on out for lunch. So he came out to the fraternity house. They served hot chocolate. He thought that was the greatest thing that he'd ever had. He'd never had a cup of hot chocolate. Never knew what it was. He never forgot that.
Now, did you remember any severe illnesses or injury your mother had when you were growing up?
No, fortunately, we were all in pretty good shape, healthy. We kept healthy. We had a family doctor. You had one doctor. You didn't go to 3 different doctors when you were young. You went to, like we do today, to go to specialists. We had the family doctor, and he would come to our house. And, he went one day kiddingly said to us, your stomachs are like slop sinks. You eat so much food and everything, but everything seems to maintain.
And that's true to this day for all of us, I think. What cemetery is your mom buried in?
Mayfield.
And that's right here in Cleveland.
Yeah.
Is it Cleveland Heights?
Cleveland, Mayfield Cemetery. The family is there. We have a plot with a headstone, big headstone, and it's in the same area right next to the Hayes family. So that was not done by design, but it turned out to be that way. All of the families are in that area in the cemetery.
Do you remember discussing her attitude toward death and dying at all in her later years?
Never discussed it. My mother lived to be 87, and except for the last 3 years of her life, she was in excellent health and had never complained. I would talk to my mother several times a week, and when I was living in New York at that time, where I moved in 1938, and she died in 1967, so it was a long time. And every time I'd call her on the phone, she would, "Arthur, darling, how wonderful of you to call," like I'd never called before.
Is there anything about your mother that I didn't ask you that you want to add?
No, nothing really. I think we've covered. My father was a very interesting businessman. He was a real pro. He was loved by the people who worked for him. He was a difficult taskmaster, but everybody loved him. Had such respect for him.
What was his childhood like?
Pardon?
What was his childhood like?
Well, he was raised by his grandparents. His mother passed away, as I told you, in childbirth. So his grandparents, his grandfather, and grandmother took him to their place where they lived.
On what side of the family? His mother's side of the family? Grandparents?
No, on my father's side of the family. And on his father's side of the family. And they raised him, and then as he got older, went to school and so forth, and then decided to come to the United States. And I'm sort of, it's difficult to talk too much about it because we discussed it. But my father said that I used to hear stories from other people about him. When he went to Chicago and first went there, he went to the ballpark, and they sold peanuts and stuff, like a lot of the young men did in those days when they first came. And he knew that wasn't for him, so he got into he made overalls. And would buy the material and cut it, and sell it, have it made, and that's how he got his capital to go into business.
Well, he was raised in Hungary, and then he came over. And how old was he approximately?
He was 16 years old when he came over.
16 by himself too, right?
By himself, and he did have some friends or family friend in Chicago.
What did your father look like?
Well, I have the painting, and I have also a photograph. I'm going to let you have one. I think, Tony, if you, hopefully that you'll have a room somewhere in your house where you can put some of these old pictures, family pictures. But I think I'd rather discuss our life in Cleveland when each of us got married, and also with our in-laws and so forth, because I think it's very interesting.
Yeah, well, we have plenty of time, and that's why I just wanted to, we can do some of that, but if I can do it in chronological order,
Go ahead.
then it will come out. But what I'm planning on doing is we can tape more, maybe involve more sometime, and then again when we see you again. But I just wanted to ask you a few more things about your father, because we don't know that much about him.
All right.
Before he got married, or before he came over here, do you remember? Did he ever mention on what he did?
He worked in a store. That I know, and I saw the store when I was there. And when we went to this town in Hungary where he grew up, there was a cemetery there where all of the family prior to the ones that came to this country were buried. And it was a beautiful cemetery up on a hill, and the caretaker said to my father in German, then I'm going to give your son the key to the cemetery because there'll be no one here again from the family, and you might just as well take it. And it was a small cemetery, had a gate all the way around it, on 4 sides.
Now this is it. We're in Hungary.
This was a town called Aparius. Don't ask me to spell it because I can't. But it was about not too far from Budapest. As I recall, it was north of Budapest, northeast of Budapest. It later became Czechoslovakia.
Well, let's take a little break where we can stretch. I'll stop the film.
All right.
We can say hi to Lee.
And the only thing I ever regret is that we didn't, when Jeannie, when Mom broke up the house, he couldn't use all that furniture. And Jeannie said, Mom, put it in storage, put it in storage. They could have given it to the orphan's home, they could have given it anywhere, but they didn't.
Good thing she had the foresight.
Oh, Christ, yes, it was a good thing. And Jeannie's was the one that made up her mind to take it all when they moved in the other house.
Well, let's continue with your father a little.
You
bit.
got it turned on?
Yeah, everything's going.
Good.
You told a good story about characterizing your mother about the 18 men coming over for lunch that one day. If you had to tell a couple good stories to characterize your father, what would come to mind?
Oh, there are various funny things that happen. These are all secondhand stories because I was never present there. But my dad, when we traveled in Europe, it was wonderful. And we had this car, and unloading the car, they had this accident with the car. They dropped it on what do they call these things that they tie up the ships to? I know the name so well, I can't think of it at the moment.
One of those giant cleats type things?
No, it was an iron post that they looped the ropes around. A stanchion. Anyway, the lowering the car and the unloading machinery skipped a couple of notches, and the car came down. The transmission under the car on this iron thing. They pulled the car back up again, moved it over. And when I went down to see the car looked like, it looked gorgeous. I mean, I hadn't seen the car, because it was a new car that was bought after I went to Paris. And
so you were in Paris and they were coming to visit?
I was in Paris when they came over to meet me. And anyway, when they picked me up, rather. Anyway, I get in the car, and my dad he got up at 6 o'clock to see it. I slept a little later. And I couldn't believe what I was seeing. So my father and I went to the captain to tell the captain what happened to the car, make sure that, because we had insurance and we wanted to be able to tell people what happened, so we collect the insurance and everything else. So my dad tells the story in German, because we were in Germany. This was in Hamburg, Germany. Cuxhaven was the port. And he tells the whole story. And I memorized the story as he told it. So we would go from one guy to the next, all the way up the ladder, including where we had the car fixed in Germany, in Berlin. And my father would say, in Germany, he would say, now my son will tell you what happened to the car. So I went through this routine. They were unloading the car and hit the stanchion, whatever it was, and go through all of the problems. And if he stopped me in the middle, if the guy would want to know something, it would throw me off. I'd have to figure out where I stopped and where I picked it up. But I was like a parrot, as you can understand. And we got a lot of laughs out of that because of so many different things that happened with it. And we just had a wonderful life together. My dad was a fabulous man, I thought. I mean, he was wonderful to me, and he was such fun to be with. And we did everything. We always went to the best places, and we did but you'd never know it. It was just a routine thing as far as my father was concerned. And he never crossed me on anything. If I really wanted to do something, he would always support me. Go ahead, give it a chance, try it out. Never really tore me down. It was always, go.
What kind of education did he have?
Well, he was self-educated. He went through high school, in Europe, through high school. He took some classes when he came over to this country. But he had a wonderful feel for business. He had a sense of fashion and style. He knew he would try and anticipate what the market would want, what the consumers would want to buy. And he had the best designers that he came across, and he built a very fine business. It was the only business in Cleveland, in the needle trades, that was listed on the Cleveland Stock Exchange. It was a public company. Went public in 1920. And he sold about 20% of the business and kept 80%, and then bought back the other 20% as it became available on the stock market.
What social class was he when he was growing up in Europe? Were they middle class or upper class in Hungary?
No, they were farming, and until he became a young man, able to work, they were always on the farm. So he just grew up with. They had no TV in those days. They had no television. They had nothing. They would read. They would study. They would do their work.
What kind of hobbies did he have?
Well, he played golf. His hobbies was his business. That's all I can say. They would go to the factory. He would go to the factory. They went to the factory on Sunday morning. Probably one of the nice things that you might enjoy hearing about was that they had their offices on the first floor in the building, and they were beautifully paneled and tile floor, and it was a showroom and all this. They had a wonderful physical setup, beautifully done, and they would serve lunch in the room. They had a very good cook at the factory. They had a cafeteria, and she would make lunch for them. They'd sit around the table, eat lunch, and talk business, which was nice. And there were many funny stories about it. One I can remember very well. My dad would go to New York about every 2, 3 weeks or 4 weeks, at least once a month, to buy the fabrics and see what's going on, obviously, because it was the headquarters in those days for fashion and everything else.
He traveled by train?
Yeah, would take the sleeper. There was an 8 o'clock train went in and came in the morning around 7:45 or 8 o'clock, a sleeper, and all the men that had to go to New York would take that train. They had a bunch of them on the train that knew each other, and I went down, chauffeur picked me up at school, and I went down to the office to pick up my dad. I went to the dentist or something. It took me to the dentist, and then went to the factory to pick up Dad. And I walked into his office. It was in 1923, in the fall of the year, and I saw a raccoon coat. And I knew the coat was for me. It was my 16th birthday, I think it was. And I couldn't say anything to my dad, so I made like I never went in the office. And they were upstairs working. I went on to the second floor of the building where they used to get together to figure costs and whatnot. And then we went downstairs to go to his office and to go home. And he said, Arthur, I brought you a present from New York. And I put that coat on, and it was we had plenty of warm days in October. But I put on the coat, and I had a Chrysler Roadster. And I went over and saw Marion Bing Garson. She was the first girl I went to see with my fur coat. It was a hot afternoon.
And where is that coat now?
Lori's got the coat.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, Lori still got it. I hope she does.
She still does. I know she does. Was your father? He was of slight build. Was he physically strong?
No, he was a little bit taller than I am, They called him the chief. His brothers and other people in the factory, they all called him the chief. And he was, he in business, I think he was pretty much of a loner. He'd make up his mind, and he'd carry it through the way he saw it. And then when we went to later on when we went to Europe, he turned over the business to his two younger brothers, and his other brother, who was the financial man, and the factory man, who was a cousin of his, and they ran the business. And things went along pretty well until the Depression. And then when the Depression came, it was tough. The unions went out on strike. And in 1933, when FDR was elected first term, the NRA, that came into business, that's the National Recovery Act. And I went to Washington to represent the local market, and they put me on the national board, and I sat in on everything west of Philadelphia. There was another man from Chicago and myself, two of us, that were on the board. It was quite an experience because I was a very young man still. I was 23 or 4 when that happened. And yeah, that was right. And I got to know the New York market pretty well.
You mentioned your father was a loner in business, that he pretty much made his decisions and went that way. Now, what about socially? Did he like to be around large groups of people, or?
Oh yeah, he enjoyed their friends. They used to have a poker game every other Saturday night. The poker crowd. There were about 10 or 12 of them would get together. 5 couples, 4 or 5 couples. And that went on for years. And then they had the women's bridge club, 12 or 13 of them. They would have parties every month. They would go down to a little resort near Columbus, Ohio, where they would have the weekends and so forth. They would go to French Lick, Indiana in the early days, and they would go to other places. And other resorts. As a group, they would love it.
What skills or talents do you think you inherited from your father?
What, gilded?
Skills have you inherited?
What skills I've inherited? Well, I think I can attribute a lot of my business knowledge to him. I think that we had in many ways, probably a similar personality. He was very friendly with people, met people easily, and I believe that rubbed off to a pretty good degree on me. The ones that influenced my life mostly were, of course, my dad, my father-in-law, Eugene Hayes, and Dave Skull, and I.F. Freiberger, who was the #1 banker in Ohio, and not only that, but one of the top people in the community. And I think that there were influences that Mr. Nate Dalby and so on. I was very friendly with these men. They were very wonderful to me as a young man, and I think that all helped me.
Your father was real busy with work. Did he have time for civic activities and that stuff too?
Yes, he was active at the temple. I mean, he would go to temple every Sunday to hear Rabbi Silver, and of course Rabbi Silver was a renowned orator and also a renowned rabbi. He played a big part in Zionism and the formation of Israel and so forth and so on. But more than that, he was a very dear friend of my father's, and my mother too. And my father, I have a book from the community fund in those days that was started here in Cleveland, as you know. And we were the first city, and very, what should I say, he believed that people had an obligation to keep, to help the city and the community as best he could. He was very charitable with the charities, but he also, with Belfair, he took three boys every year out of the classes and trained them, either in the business or as salespeople or whatever. And all of them turned out very well. And that was life in Cleveland in those days. People helped each other as best they could.
Was he involved in politics at all?
No, not politically.
Was he a Republican or?
Oh yes, he was a Republican.
Was he, like, let's try to describe his personality more. Was he an emotional type of person, or was he
No, he was
fun?
he was a steady person. He enjoyed better things in life, and he also enjoyed his friends. They always had dinner parties and things like that, entertaining their home in those days, and mostly in the home, and when they went away on trips. But he thought young. He really did. He didn't. He was, you know. When I thought he was a much older man, obviously, because in those days we all considered anybody that was our parents as an elderly person, but they really weren't. They enjoyed life, and he had a lot of funny stories in business and so forth that we all got a kick out of.
Do you remember any of those stories?
No, I can't remember too many of them anymore, but they were always, I'll never forget one time we had to go somewhere to work with a customer, and he got one of the young men in the office in New York to carry the suitcase, the samples. And it was a hot day, and we're walking, and we see this guy with these two cases, and we saw that poor guy. We laughed about it, but we really had a feeling for these people that worked for us.
Do you remember him ever? You mentioned your mother got a little upset with you with the crayons. Do you remember him ever losing his temper with anything that you did?
Not really.
Did she take the car one time?
Oh, so many things. As a youngster, they went to California and were going to have the car painted. So they bought a Ford sedan, a Model T sedan, so that the car would be in the paint shop for 6 weeks while I were gone. And we always had 2 cars. Sometimes we had 3. And when I grew up, when I was driving, and then Mildred was driving, and eventually Helene, we always had 3 or 4 cars around the place. But my father was a very fast driver, and he would look in the store windows to see what was going on, the display windows. And one time we were driving, and a policeman comes up and drives alongside and tells him to pull over. The policeman walks over to the car, and my father puts out his hand and says, "Hello, how are you?" As if the guy was paying a social visit. And that's the way it was. I mean, he had a good sense of humor. And he used to have a milkshake and grain crackers for lunch, or a glass of milk with grain crackers. I ate, toward the end, he didn't eat too much. And he kept his body, it was in pretty good shape. Never was too fat, never was sick really. He had some minor things, but he was a healthy person.
And your father's buried?
Oh, he let me take the car one day. This is a cute story. He was out of town, and whenever he was out of town, and I was driving then, I would take the car to school, and everybody would make a big fuss about it in school. And one day I forgot to bring the car home. I forgot I had the car in the morning, and I went and took the streetcar all the way out to Fairmount Boulevard, had to go back downtown and get the car. But those were fun days.
What's the most important thing you think you learned from your father?
Well, I think that I learned a family feeling. I think that I learned to be a good citizen. I mean, to participate in various causes. I mean, not that I devoted all that much time to it because I was too busy in business, but I did always work with the Associated Jewish Charities, Community Fund, in wherever I was, and I just to try to be a good husband. That was about. We had a wonderful family relationship, all of us. I could sit down and talk to my dad about any subject. Never had any hesitancy about coming out with something. And we got along great. We had a lot of fun together.
Okay, let's go on now with, is there anything else you want to add about your father? Is there anything that, any other characteristics?
No, but there are always interesting stories about him. He was a wonderful, wonderful man. But I imagine most sons felt the same way about their dad, and that they also found their fathers to be very interesting. But I was particularly interested. We were very close. And there was no subject that came up in our family that we hesitated to talk about. Whether it was one of my sisters or whether it was my mother or anything, we were very open with each other.
Let's go on now with other members of the family. Did you have any favorite uncles or aunts that were real important to you when you were growing up?
Well, of course we had a big family. My father's family was a big family. There were, as I mentioned before, there were 11 children in the family total. And
well, I want to clear something up with it. Now, when he was born, did his mother die?
His mother died in childbirth.
Okay, and then he was the first son, the first child born.
Yeah.
And then then your father, his father ended up marrying his wife or your grandmother's sister.
He ended up marrying my grandmother's or my father's mother's sister.
Or his aunt, so to speak.
Yeah.
So then and then they had 10 more children.
That's right.
And he was the first to come over.
He was the first one.
Okay.
Brought the others over.
And then he brought them over.
Well, he brought the parents, and the parents, the other children came with the parents.
And they were all just half brothers and sisters, but he was 16.
But they were not treated that way. They were
right. They were
one family,
right.
Sure.
He was 16, so they were all much younger.
Well, there were 3 or 4 of them born in this country, and the other boys were all younger.
Do you remember any? Were there any favorites of that? Do you remember any of your uncles or aunts?
Yeah. Well, on my mother's side, my favorite was the doctor. He was a wonderful man. Had this gorgeous home up in Arkville, and as I told you earlier, we would visit there, and I would go up there for a month every summer. On my mother's side, they were all very nice people. Both the younger 2 brothers were in the business, and I would go with them on business to a city or travel with them for a day or 2. And I would pitch hit for them if they were laid up or something. I went to Washington, D.C. for Charlie one time, and I went out west for Leo. And but we got along. We all got along well.
Were there any cousins that you remember who were important to you, and any of your cousins?
Yeah, my cousin Armand Irf and Carl Erf, that was the doctor's older boys. We were very friendly with them, and they were very important people, both of them in their own way. And my father's family, they were all much younger than I was, my cousins, that is, majority of them. Those that lived were, one or two of them passed away in those years, in the early years. And as I said, they've all been very successful. They've built wonderful businesses, and I hope someday that you'll get to know them, their sons.
Did you have any favorite cousin? One favorite that you can think
Well,
of?
yes, I like Lawrence Korach. He's a very fine gentleman, and I keep in touch with him.
Where is he?
He's in Cleveland.
In Cleveland? Do you remember what he was like?
Irving Korach is in Miami, and he's an architect, and I see him when I go to Florida.
Do you have any? Do you remember stories? Did your families get together a lot on holidays and?
Yes, we used to go to Akron frequently in the old days. It would take us 3 hours to drive to Akron, 35 or 40 miles from here. And the roads were so bad that we get stuck in the mud and all that. One trip we took to Cincinnati. My father drove, and my mother was upset the way he was driving, so he said, "Arthur, you take the wheel." I was about 14 years old or 12 years old. I could hardly reach the pedals, but I drove the car. And there were many funny stories of that kind. I'll never forget, we went over to see Grandpa and Grandma on one Sunday afternoon, and my father would let me sit between his legs and I'd drive the car. I was about 9 years old or 10 years old. And I used to fool around with the car in the yard on 73rd Street. One time I backed the car up, went right through the garage door, and the chauffeur was terribly upset because he let me do that. And my dad was coming in from New York the next morning, and he had that garage door fixed that day.
How about your brother? Well, actually, how about your sisters?
My brother-in-laws and
Well, no, just your sisters. Why don't you tell me about them?
Well, we became very close to each other. When Mildred was first married in 1923, she was a young bride. She was 18 years old, just 19, I think, after she was married. Dave was 21 after he was married. And they were living with us on Fairmount Boulevard. My folks went to Europe, and my sister would get lonesome, so we'd stay home from school and play cards with her or do something like that.
No, Aunt why don't you tell me the order of an age?
Mildred, your Aunt Mill, was the oldest. Then I was in the middle, and Helene was the youngest. And there was 3 years difference between us. And we always got along well together.
Did you take care of them, or they take care of you when you were younger? Do you
Well,
remember?
it was a combination. When my parents would go to Europe and we'd be in the house, when Mildred lived with us, she was the boss, and when she moved to her own house, I was the boss. And when my parents were away, and I say the boss, I mean, I'd have a couple of guys over to spend the night with me, or the weekend, or whatever. And my room, off my room, was an enclosed sleeping porch. It was like another room. We had 200-door beds there, so I'd have 3 guys over for the weekend. We'd have a hell of a time. I'd have fellas visit me from out of town. They'd all come.
Did they come often when your parents were out of town?
They came when they were home, and also when they were out of town. There were 2 friends in particular Alfred Farber and John Tudor, and his parents went away in the winter. And when his parents would be away, I'd be up there staying with them. And when my parents went away, they'd come down and stay with me.
And why was that?
Well, we're just good friends.
And did you feel like you'd get away with a lot more when the parents weren't there?
Well, we didn't really get away with a lot more. There'd be nobody to check us in at night or anything like that, so that we would, and then we all had a good time. Some of the older fellows I became very friendly with Eddie Green and Tony Anthony and Bob Hayes and so forth. And we would drive to Ann Arbor for a football game or Detroit. We'd have a lot of fun together.
You're going back to your two sisters. When you're obviously, I guess Nursey was there, so you didn't really have to worry about taking care of each other. But you remember any real funny stories, maybe when your parents were out of town, or anything that?
Well, my parents were in Europe, and I had a date to go to a dance at the Excelsior Club, and I told the chauffeur I was too young to drive the car, to take the car on my own, and we got down to 93rd Street, or 105th Street, and I said to him, Mike, you go home and I'll take the car, and I took the car, and I was so small that they thought the car, a mounted policeman stopped me. He wanted to make sure that there was somebody in the car, and then when he saw that I was too young, he took me in, didn't take me to the station, but he made me stop until I called up home, and Dave, my brother-in-law, Dave Scull, came, and your Uncle Dave, and picked me up and took me to the club with Bob Grease was with him. They were playing bridge and all. And
You had a date that night?
yeah, I had a date.
And do you remember what happened? What were you embarrassed?
No, I wasn't embarrassed. We went over and picked her up. Only Dave drove. I didn't. And Mike, the chauffeur, he went home. He went to his home, so I didn't see him till the next day. But we didn't get in any trouble. My parents were away, and they didn't know anything about it till they got home. We told the story.
And why don't we talk about Aunt Mill for a little while?
Mill and Dave were married, as I mentioned, very young, and lived with us, and we had a lot of fun when they were there. Dave went to law school, got his degree, and I went over to Europe with him on the ship the first time I went over in 1929 on the Mauritania, and it was a wonderful experience. And then we got to Paris, and I went to a lower priced hotel, and they went to the George V, which was a fine hotel, a new hotel. And I got an apartment the next day and worked there, and they went down to southern France. And in those days, it was unusual to make a long distance call. I took sick or something, got a cold. I had the name of a doctor in Paris and also other people, if in case anything happened. But they checked up on me, and they were worried. They hadn't talked to me, so in those days they phoned Paris. I talked to them on the phone, and everything was all right. But we looked after each other. We always have looked after each other.
What was Aunt Mill like when you were growing up together?
She was very popular. She was an attractive girl, but not what I would call a beauty. And she had a very exciting, interesting life. Went to camp, Tripoli camp, and then went to a boarding school in Merrimack, New York. And then she and Dave decided to get married. They were married in August of 1923. And it was a beautiful event at the Excelsior Club. Dave had 18 ushers, or 12 ushers, or whatever it was, and they came from all over. And my uncle from New York came, and other family from out of town. And it was a beautiful occasion. And then I was the next to get married. in 1931. That was 8 years after Mill. And Mildred had, Mac was born, Malcolm was born in 1925, Shotzi in 1928, and Joni in 1931.
What, do you remember any funny stories about Aunt Mill when you were growing up?
Well, there were not too many funny stories. I mean, we were always giggling about something. But she would have her dates, and there were no problems with that. We all knew each other pretty well rather, and it was always fun to have her friends there at the house. And they stayed. Those friends were friends all through our entire life. And then I had my friends, and we always had company. We had no feelings that we could invite anybody we wanted for dinner if it was convenient for everybody, for my mother, and we always had somebody there among our friends. And when I was 16 years old, they had a surprise party for me. We went out to dinner, I remember, and then we were up on the third floor in the ballroom. All my friends were gathered there. And I said, Dave's call said, let's go upstairs. And I said, what are we going upstairs for? To the third floor. And he said, well, come on up, we'll play a little pool or something. And open the door, and we go up the stairs, and we get to the top of the stairs, everybody yells surprise, and of course it was a lot of fun. And, but that's, our life was, at home was very exciting and thrilling. We loved our home. We all loved it. And Dave was a wonderful guy. We became very close, more like brothers than brother-in-laws, and we never had any ill feelings or any problems. And I would say that my two sisters and their husbands were among my closest friends.
Now, going to your other sister, Helene, she was
She
born.
was younger.
She was born 3 years. She's 3 years younger than you.
3 years younger than I am. Yeah. And she was the baby of the family, Pet, as we called her. And
do you remember how she got that name?
I can't remember, but it's been there so long. It was maybe when she was still a little girl. She was the pet of the family because she was younger. And we had Mercy, who looked after us. And,
did your sisters play any sports? What did they? Any special abilities or skills?
Well, they all took piano lessons, and I think we all took piano lessons. I took violin lessons at one point, and Helene went to private school, Hathaway Brown, which was a fine school in Cleveland. Mildred, as I told you before, went to East High School, and her friends, many of them were there, and she's still, those that are left, still living, are still very close friends. And they later became my friends and Helene's friends.
Tell me a little bit more about David Skull. How did you meet him? How did the family meet?
Well, David lived in Cleveland, and his mother passed away in childbirth, and he was raised by his aunt. And his father was a wonderful man, and they lived on East Boulevard in Cleveland. And Dave came into our family just as if he was one of us. We were always very friendly. He was a wonderful guy, in fact, a very good business mind. He was going to be a lawyer originally, and then he wanted to go in the brokerage business. And that's how we got into the business. He opened it in October of 1928, just before the crash, and it wasn't easy, but we survived it. And he went on to become president of the Cleveland Stock Exchange, and when it was merged with the Chicago Exchange, he went to, when they moved to Chicago to A.G. Becker, and he was made a partner there, which was a big underwriting firm. And very important financial firm in Chicago.
When was this around? What year was that?
That was in 1948, he first went to Chicago, and they moved there in 1952, 4 years later. So they kept the house on Fairmount Boulevard. Mom moved in from Demington. When I was a young man, I came home one day from the factory in 1930, after my father had passed away. I think it was in 35 or 36. And Mom was living alone in the big house on Fairmount, and I sit at the mill, and Mother at lunch one day. There was a family funeral, and I came home early for lunch, and I said to them at lunch, why don't you switch houses? Why don't you, Mom, move over to Demington, and Mill, you come into Fairmount, because you have 3 children, the same as we were, and it'd be an ideal move for you. So they did that. They switched houses, and it only took about 6 weeks. They sent the furniture, whatever had to be redone, and Mom was in California for 5 weeks or whatever, and but when she came home, she went right to Demington Drive. Everything was in place like she had just left it.
Now, is this the Demington house that the Stars lived in?
The house of what?
That
Helena and Alfred moved there later.
And that's
They were when they came home from California. My mother was had rented the house to someone else. When she what happened was, oh, wait a minute, I'm ahead of myself. They moved back to Cleveland in the early 40s, and Mom, when Dave went to the service, he was the first one in the service, and he went in August of 1942, and Mom went over to live on Fairmount Boulevard. We thought that would be better for her to be there with the children and Mildred, because Mildred was going with Dave to Florida, where he had basic training, and then went to Carolina, where he was stationed at Fort Bragg, went to Pinehurst, the Southern Pines, one of the towns there. And so Mom rented the Demington Drive house to another couple, and then when Helena and Alfred came home, they put back to Cleveland. There was no place for them to live, so they rented a house for a year or two and then moved into Demington Drive. And Mom stayed on Fairmount Boulevard, which was good because Mildred and David eventually went to Chicago, and she had a place to live.
okay. Well, why don't we stop today? I think we covered a lot.
Well, we can, if you want to go another, well, it's 5 o'clock.
Yeah, it's starting to get late.
Okay.
So
Now
we'll
we
do
gotta
it.
play it back and take a look at it.